The third night of the great snow, a woman with child stood at the iron gates of Ferrelwood and pressed her cheek to the frozen bars because her knees would no longer hold her upright. The wind came across the forest in long gray ropes, taking the breath out of her before she could use it. Snow had filled the seams of her cloak and the worn places at her heels, and the small bundle of all she owned had gone heavy as a stone against her side. She did not knock. She had been turned from 3 doors that day, and she had learned what the sound of her own knuckles produced. She only stood, one hand spread flat below her heart where the child lay, and she waited to see whether the cold or the gatekeeper would reach her first. A lantern came swinging down the avenue of bare trees, throwing the shadows of branches across the snow like the bones of some enormous hand. Behind it walked a tall man in a dark coat, hatless, the snow settling unmelted in his black hair. He did not call out a greeting. He stopped a single pace from the gate and looked at her through the bars the way a man looks at a thing he cannot account for, and the lantern light caught the pale gray of his eyes and the long, old line of a scar that ran from his left temple down into the hair above his ear. "This is the king's land," he said, his voice low. "No one comes here in winter." Her lips had gone too stiff for grace. "I came," she said. What he did in the next moment, she would turn over in her mind for the rest of her life, because he did not turn away. He set the lantern down in the snow, drew a ring of keys from his coat, and opened the gate that the whole forest had been built to keep shut. Her name was Esme, and 6 months earlier she had possessed a husband, a position, and a future she had believed to be settled as a stone in a wall. She had been lady's maid to a great house in the north, and she had married the steward's clerk, a gentle, careful man named Lyle, who read aloud to her in the evenings and saved his wages in a tin behind the chimney brick. They had wanted nothing. The world considered grand, a cottage, someday, a child, the slow accumulation of ordinary years. The fever took Lyle in 9 days that autumn, between the first frost and the burying, and it left her with the tin nearly empty, and the child already turning under her ribs, and a black gown borrowed from a woman who wanted it back. The mistress of the house had been kind in the way that costs nothing. She had let Esme keep her place through the worst of the grief. Then the new daughter-in-law arrived, a young wife with opinions about the staff, and she did not care to see a widow grown round with child moving through the bright rooms where suitors were expected to be impressed. She summoned Esme to the morning room on a Tuesday, and folded her hands and explained the matter as though discussing the weather. "You understand how it appears," the young wife said. "A servant in your condition with no husband to show for it. People talk. We cannot have the house associated with that sort of thing. You are, when all is said, only a maid who forgot her place. There are charitable houses in the town. I am sure one of them will take you." Esme had not wept. She had learned the uselessness of it. She had packed the tin and the 2 gowns and the small framed silhouette of Lyle cut from black paper, and she had walked out into a country going hard with early winter, and she had gone south, because south was where the roads ran, with no plan beyond the next village and the next after that. The snow had caught her on the road 4 days from anywhere. It had driven her off the highway and into the forest tracks, and the forest tracks had narrowed and forked and lied to her, until at the end of the 3rd night they delivered her half-frozen to a gate she had no reason to expect would open. The man who had opened it did not offer his arm. He picked up her bundle as though it weighed nothing, lifted the lantern, and walked, and she understood that she was meant to follow or to die in the avenue, and that he had left the choice entirely to her. She followed. The lodge rose out of the snow at the end of the trees, long and low, and built of the same gray forest stone as the wall, with smoke standing straight up from 2 of its chimneys and amber light pressed thin against the small old windows. It was not a palace. It was something better to a freezing woman. It was warm. Inside, a fire the size of a doorway burned in a hall hung with the antlers of 100 years of royal hunts. A broad woman in an apron came out of a passage, wiping her hands, took one look at Esme, and stopped saying whatever she had meant to say. "Lord above," the woman breathed. "She's blue to the lips." Sit her here, my lord, by the fire. No, closer, Bran. The warming pan and the good blanket from the press. I am no one's trouble, Esme tried to say. I will be gone at first light. You will be gone when you can stand, without falling into the grate, the cook said, which was the kindest cruelty anyone had offered her in a season. Her name was Mrs. Hesketh, and she had cooked for 3 kings in that lodge, and feared none of them. And she set about Esme now with hot bricks and a bowl of broth and a running commentary that asked no answers. A wiry man with a weathered face and a deferential stoop brought the blanket. That was Bran, the keeper of the forest, who said almost nothing and missed almost nothing, and who looked at the master of the lodge with the watchful affection of a man who has served someone a long time and grown to like him against his own better judgment. The master stood apart from all of it, by the tall window, his back half turned, watching the snow come down out of the dark. He had not given her his name. She did not ask. She had learned, in her months on the road, that a roof was a roof, and questions were a luxury. And she was content to be warm and silent, and to feel the child shift and settle as the heat reached her at last. What she did not yet know was that the man at the window was the second son of a dead king and the half-brother of the living one, that the scar at his temple had been bought at a battle the whole country knew the name of, and that he had not willingly spoken to a stranger in 2 years. She learned his name 3 days later, and she learned it from a quarrel. The snow did not stop. It came down for a day and a night, and another day, until the forest was sealed, and the road to the town was a memory under 6 feet of white, and there was no question of Esme leaving, because there was nowhere for her to go, and no way to reach it. Mrs. Beatty. Hesketh installed her in a small warm room off the kitchen passage and put her to work the moment her hands stopped shaking, because work was the only currency the lodge dealt in, and because the cook had judged, correctly, that the woman would mend faster with something to do than with pity. Esme mended linen. She turned the heels of the men's stockings. She learned the house, its cold passages and its few warm rooms, and she kept out of the way of the master, whose name the servants spoke as his lordship, and never otherwise, and who moved through the lodge like a man in a house he was renting from his own grief. The quarrel came up the avenue in a closed carriage that should not have been able to reach them through the drifts, drawn by 4 laboring horses and a coachman cursing the snow. Out of it stepped a woman of perhaps 60, in a traveling pelisse trimmed with sable upright as a fire, iron, with a hard, handsome face and rings on every finger, and a voice that arrived in the hall a full second before she did. "Ivo," the woman said before her boots were off the step, "you will explain to me why I have heard, in town, that you have taken a vagrant into the king's lodge." So his name was Ivo. Esme, on the gallery's stair with an armful of mended linen, went still. "Aunt Margaret," the man said. He had risen from the chair by the fire. He did not cross to greet her. "You should not have traveled in this." "I should not have needed to." The Dowager Marchioness, for that was what she was, the widow of his late uncle, and the self-appointed manager of every Rethaway affair she could reach, drew off her gloves 1 finger at a time. "There are arrangements pending in this family that a winter of your sulking will not improve." His Majesty grows impatient. "I have come to settle the matter of Selmount once and for all, and I find you have filled the place with strays. Send her to the town, the road is closed. Then send her to the town when it opens." Lady Margaret's gaze found Esme on the stair, traveled down the length of her and back up, and arrived at the obvious with no flicker of warmth. A breeding servant with no husband and no character. "Do you imagine no one will speak of it? You are the king's brother. You cannot keep a fallen maid in a royal house and pretend it costs you nothing." "She is not fallen," Ivo said, and there was a flatness in it like a door closing. "She is widowed. There is a difference, even you can see it." "There is no difference the world can see," his aunt returned, "and the world is the only judge that pays." He did not answer that. Esme had gone hot, and then cold. with the shame of being discussed across a hall as though she were a parcel of disputed goods. And she made herself finish the stair and carry the linen to the press and not weep, because weeping changed nothing, and she had a child to keep, and a winter to survive. Behind her the two voices went on, lower now, and she caught only the shape of it. The aunt wanted something, the nephew would not give it. The thing the aunt wanted had a name, and the name was Selmount, and it would be some weeks before Esme understood that Selmount was a marquisate, a title and lands and a seat, and that Lady Margaret had come through 6 feet of snow to marry her nephew off to it. That night late she went down to the kitchen for warm milk to settle the child who had taken to kicking in the small hours, and she found the master of the lodge sitting alone at the long deal table with a single candle and a glass he had not touched. He did not send her away. She poured her milk at the hearth and would have gone, and his voice stopped her. "You heard what she said on the stair." "I hear a great deal I am not meant to, my lord. It is the nature of the work." "Does it trouble you what she called you?" Esme considered the question with the honesty. She had stopped being able to afford anyone but herself. "It troubles me less than it did the first 100 times, she said. "A name is only true if you agree to answer to it." I have stopped answering. Something moved in his scarred face that was not quite a smile, and was the nearest thing to one she had yet seen there. "My brother sits a throne," he said after a while, looking into the candle. "I sat a horse once at a place you will have heard of. I came back from it with this." He touched the line at his temple without seeming to know he did it, and with the knowledge that a man can do everything the world asks of him and be ruined for it anyway. "I do not much care. Now, what the world will say, my aunt has not forgiven me the indifference. She mistakes it for sulking." It was a great deal of speech for a man who did not speak. Esme understood that she had been handed something he did not hand to many, and she held it carefully, and she said only, "Then we are two who have stopped answering to our names," and she took her milk and went, and behind her she heard him give one short breath that might, in a warmer man, have been a laugh. The child came in the deepest part of the winter, on a night when the wind tore at the lodge until the antlers shivered on the walls. Mrs. Hesketh, who had brought half the keeper's family into the world, sent Bran for hot water and clean linen, and stood between Esme and her fear, with the flat competence of a woman who had decided the matter would go well, and would brook no argument from it. It went well. Toward dawn, when the wind had dropped and the first gray came thin and clean across the snow, Esme held the daughter against her, small and furious and entirely alive, and she wept at last, because some weeping is not weakness, but the body letting go of a thing it has carried too long. She named the girl Rena, for no grander reason than that a wren had nested in the eave above her childhood window and sung in all weathers, and a creature that small had no business surviving an English winter and survived it anyway. The lodge, which had been a house of men and silence, rearranged itself around the small new sound without anyone deciding that it should. Mrs. Hesketh made up a basket by the kitchen fire. Bran carved a rattle from a piece of cherry wood and presented it with the gravity of a man laying tribute. And Ivo himself, who came to the kitchen now more often than his habits explained, would stand at a careful distance from the basket and look down into it, with an expression Esme could not read, until one evening she watched him put out one long finger and let the sleeping child's hand close around it, and she watched his face change, and she understood that whatever Lady Margaret wanted of him, this was not the man his aunt believed she was bargaining with. Lady Margaret had not gone. The snow had kept her too, and a dowager marchioness trapped by weather in a house she means to govern is a force that finds its outlet. She set herself through the long white weeks to the project of Selmount with the patience of a woman who has never been finally refused. And the instrument she had chosen arrived the week the roads first cleared, in a smaller carriage, in a gown the color of forced lilac that no woman could have worn in that snowlight without intention. Aveline Corvain was 24, the daughter of a baron. Lady Margaret had known since girlhood, and she had been raised from the cradle on the understanding that she was the sort of woman great men married. She was not unkind. Exactly. She was incurious which in a house is worse. She moved through the lodge as though it were a stage set built to flatter her. She called Esme the girl when she troubled to refer to her at all. And she made one observation, on the first evening, that Lady Margaret repeated with satisfaction at dinner. "I confess I did not expect the household to be quite so irregular," Aveline said, drawing off her gloves before the great fire, looking not at Esme but past her. A servant with a child underfoot, and no master to the child. At home she would not have lasted a week. One does not keep that sort of woman where there are standards to maintain. That was the second time the label was spoken aloud, in a different room and a different voice, and had landed differently than the first, because this time it was said in front of the man, and Esme saw his jaw tighten and his hand go still on the arm of his chair. And she saw, too, that he said nothing, and she did not yet know whether his silence was indifference or restraint. She gathered the milk things and withdrew. In the kitchen, Mrs. Hesketh slammed a pot down hard enough to make the candle jump. "Standards," the cook said. "I'll give her standards. That one couldn't boil water to save her soul. And she'll tell me about households." But it was not Mrs. Bottis. Hesketh's house, and they both knew it, and the matter of who stayed and who went would not be settled in a kitchen. The weeks that followed were a slow campaign, and Esme was the ground it was fought over without ever being consulted. Lady Margaret arranged the days so that Aveline and her nephew were thrown constantly together. She arranged dinners. She arranged a music evening, at which Aveline played the pianoforte with cold accuracy, and Ivo sat through it with the courtesy of a man enduring a sermon. She praised Aveline's accomplishments at every meal, and let fall in Esme's hearing the kind of remark a great lady supposes a servant is too dull to understand. "You see how it could be," Lady Margaret said to her nephew one afternoon in the long gallery, not lowering her voice though Esme stood within 10 feet of it, polishing the cold sconces. "A proper mistress in this house. The right people received. Selmount carried forward as your uncle would have wished. Instead of a charity ward and her bastard at the kitchen fire, dragging the family name through the dirt, have you no thought for what is owed?" There it was a third time sharper than before, in the long public gallery with the winter light falling cold across the floor, and this time the heroine heard it as a verdict rather than an opinion, because 3 times a thing is said it stops being talk and starts being the shape of the world. Esme set down the cloth. She did not turn. She finished the sconce she was cleaning because the work was hers, and the work at least was honest, and she carried the box of cloths back to the press with her spine straight and her face composed, and only when the door was shut did she lean against it and let herself shake. She had decided by then that she would go the moment the road bore a cart. She told no one. She gathered her 2 gowns, and the empty tin and the black silhouette of Lyle and the cherrywood rattle, and she waited for the thaw. And she did not let herself look at the man by the window, because she had begun to feel a thing toward him she had no right to feel and no future in which to feel it. And a woman who has lost everything once learns to recognize the cliff edge before she walks off it. The thing that undid all her careful plans was a fever, and it was not her own. It came on Aveline first, a chill from the damp gallery that turned in 2 days to something that flushed her face and filled her lungs and frightened even Lady Margaret into sending Bran through the half-thawed forest for the apothecary at the town. The apothecary came, bled her, prescribed, and went, and the fever did not break. It spread. It took 2 of the grooms and the scullery girl, and then it reached into the warm rooms, and laid its hand on Lady Margaret herself, who took to her bed with a face gone grey and frightened and refused, for 2 days, to admit she was ill at all. And it was Esme who nursed them. She had nursed Lyle through 9 days of it and lost him, and she had learned in the losing everything the apothecary had not troubled to teach. She knew the cool cloth and the propped pillow and the spoonful of broth coaxed past lips that did not want it. She knew how to keep a sweating body from chilling and a chilling one from sweating itself to death. She moved between the sick rooms in the long nights with Rena sleeping in the basket Mrs. Hesketh carried from room to room behind her, and she did not sleep, and she did not stop. and she nursed the woman who had called her a fallen maid, and the woman who had called her child a thing the household should not keep, with the same plain, unwavering care she would have given anyone, because that was the whole of what she had left. That was wholly her own, the refusal to measure her mercy by what it was owed. On the worst night, when Aveline's breath rattled, and Lady Margaret lay too weak to lift her own head, it was Esme who sat between the two beds in the small hours, and would not let either of them slip. The master of the lodge found her there before dawn, a candle guttering, her sleeves wet to the elbow, the child asleep at her feet. He stood in the doorway a long moment. "You should rest," he said. "You will make yourself ill." "They will die if I rest," she said simply. "I have watched it happen for the want of someone awake. I will not watch it again." He crossed the room. He took the basin from her hands, wrung the cloth himself awkwardly, and laid it on his aunt's hot forehead. And he sat down on the other side of the bed, and through the rest of that night the king's brother and the widowed maid kept watch together over the women who had wanted her gone. Near dawn, Lady Margaret's fever broke. She came up out of it slick and trembling and clear-eyed, and the first thing those clear eyes found was Esme, asleep at last in the chair with one hand still resting on the rim of the basin. And the second thing they found was the nephew, watching the maid sleep with an expression the dowager had not seen on his face since before the war. Aveline mended slowly and left as soon as a carriage could carry her, and she left in a kind of confusion, because the household she had been promised had not been the household she found, and the man she had been brought to marry had never once looked at her the way he looked at the woman who emptied the basins. She was not heartbroken. She had not loved him. She had been told she was the right choice, and the telling had turned out to be the whole of it, and somewhere on the cold road home she understood that, and was in a small private way relieved. Lady Margaret did not leave. She mended, and she rose, and she said nothing. For 3 days, and Esme braced for the dismissal she was certain the thaw would bring. It did not come the way she expected. What came on the 4th day was worse, because Lady Margaret was not a woman who abandoned a position merely because it had grown inconvenient to her conscience. She was a woman who changed the ground. She summoned her nephew to the gallery, and Esme found afterward the shape of what had passed there, the way one finds the track of a thing in snow. The dowager had not argued mercy. She had argued law. There was, she reminded him, the matter of the king's expectation, and the matter of cell-mount, which could not pass to a man unwed past a certain term without reverting to the crown's gift, and the matter of a letter she held, written long ago by his late uncle, naming the conditions under which the marquisate was to descend. She had the letter. She produced it. And the conditions in it, read aloud in her cold, even voice, made the title contingent on a marriage she approved, by a date now 6 weeks off, or the lands would go to the crown and the name die with him. It was not a lie. That was the cruelty of it. Lady Margaret had spent the years of her widowhood gathering precisely the documents that gave her power, and she had guarded them, and she brought this one out now. Like a blade she had kept oiled for exactly this. She did not need Aveline. Aveline had only ever been the convenient instrument. What the dowager needed was for her nephew to be afraid of losing cell-mount, and to marry where she pointed, and to put the widowed maid and her child out of the house before the king's eye fell on the irregularity of it. "You will not keep her," Lady Margaret said. "You may have a softness for the creature. Soft men have ruined greater houses than this for less. You will not keep her, because the letter does not permit it, and because His Majesty arrives in this lodge in 6 weeks for the spring hunt, and he will not find his brother living in scandal with a fallen servant at the hearth. Marry as you are bid, or lose the name your father gave you. There is no third door. That was the black middle of it, and it closed over Esme, like the snow had closed over the road. She did not hear the words of the gallery. She heard the consequence, because Ivo told her himself, that same night, in the kitchen, in the plainest voice she had ever heard him use. "You have to go," he said, "not because I wish it. Because if you are here when my brother comes, My aunt will use you to break me, and she will not be gentle in the using, and you and the child will be the price of it. I can give you money. I can give you a letter of character that no one will question. I cannot give you a place at this hearth, and I am ashamed past speaking that I cannot." Esme stood very still by the fire with Rena heavy and warm against her shoulder. She had expected this. She had packed for it weeks ago. The expecting did not lessen it. "I understand, my lord," she said. "You owe me nothing. You have given me more than I came with, and that is more than most." She did not say the rest. She did not say that she had begun foolishly to imagine staying. She gathered the child closer and went to her small room and sat on the edge of the cot through the long night, and toward morning she allowed herself, exactly once, to grieve a thing that had never been hers to lose. And then she folded the grief away with the gowns and the tin and the black paper silhouette. And she made herself ready to walk out into a kinder season than the one that had brought her. And a colder errand she would have gone. She had her bundle on the kitchen table, and her cloak on her shoulders and her hand on the latch on the gray morning the carts could first get through. What stopped her was Bran, the silent keeper, who had been silent so long that the whole house had forgotten he had ever served anywhere but here. "You'll want to buy today," Bran said from the corner where he was mending a snare. He did not look up. "There's a thing his late lordship did, the old Marquess, that her ladyship has forgot, on account of she was the one as witnessed it, and folk forget what they don't want. True, I served the old man 40 year. I carried his letters to the lawyer at the town. I know which one she kept and which one she did not." Esme set her bundle down. What Bran knew, and what unspooled over the next anxious fortnight as the lodge prepared for a king, was this. The letter Lady Margaret guarded was real, and it was the first letter the old Marquess had written, naming his conditions in a season of bad temper after a quarrel with his nephew. It was not the last, though. The old man had repented the quarrel before he died. He had written a second letter, a codicil, plainly worded and properly witnessed, that struck out the conditions of the first and left Selmount to descend to Evo without contingency or wife or date, on the single condition that the man prove himself the master his father had hoped for. And the second letter had not been destroyed. It had been carried by Bran himself to the lawyer at the town and lodged there, in a sealed packet, in a deed box that the lawyer's son held still, because Lady Margaret, who knew of the quarrel in the first letter, had never known there was a second. And the lawyer had been paid by the old Marquess to hold his silence, and had held it past the grave. She could have gone to the town and fetched it in a day. She did not, because Bran counseled otherwise, and because Esme had learned the difference between a thing that is true and a thing that has been made to stand up in front of witnesses. Lady Margaret would call the codicil a forgery. She would dispute it. She would use her rank and her certainty against an old keeper and a kitchen maid. And she would very likely win, in private, behind a closed door, the way she had won everything. The codicil had to be produced where rank could not bury it. It had to be opened in front of the one man in England whose word outweighed a dowager marchioness, and that man was coming to the lodge in a fortnight to hunt. So, Esme did not flee. She stayed, on a pretext, and she helped Mrs. Wong. Hesketh readied the lodge for its king, and she carried, sewn into the lining of her bundle where no searching hand would find it, a single folded paper that Bran had ridden to the town and back to fetch, lodged with the lawyer's son, and copied true and certified under seal the old Marquess's own second letter, the one his widow's sister-in-law had spent 10 years not knowing existed. The king came on a morning of thin gold light, with snow still lying in the hollows of the forest and the first green pushing up at the edges of the rides. He came without ceremony, as men do to the places where they were boys, with a small party of riders and a great pleasure in the wood, and the lodge filled for the first time in 2 years, with boots and laughter and the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. Esme moved through it, carrying trays, invisible the way servants are invisible, her heart going hard against her ribs. Lady Margaret had dressed for it like a general. She had her nephew where she wanted him, silent and cornered, 6 weeks from the loss of his name, and she meant to settle the whole matter before the king rode home, with a betrothal announced under his majesty's own roof that not even Ivo could afterward unmake. She made her move on the second evening, in the great hall, the same hall where Esme had stood blue to the lips on the night the gate first opened, under the antlers of 100 years of hunts, before the king and his riders and the whole assembled household. Lady Margaret rose with her glass, and she spoke of family and duty and the wishes of the dead, and she announced, smiling, that her nephew, the Marquess of Selmount, had at last seen the wisdom of settling, and that an alliance long desired by both houses would shortly be confirmed. And she turned to Ivo to draw the assent out of him in front of a king who could not be contradicted without scandal. The hall went quiet, waiting. Esme stood at the side with a tray of glasses going warm in her hands, and she watched the man she loved open his mouth to lose himself, and she understood that the moment had come and would not come again, and that she had carried the paper this far and there was no honest place left to carry it but forward. She set down the tray. She crossed the floor in front of the King of England with her heart in her throat, and her hand already at the seam of her plain bodice where the certified letter lay sewn against her, and the whole hall turned to stare at the breeding servant who had dared to walk into the center of the room. "Forgive me, your majesty," she said, and her voice did not shake, because she had stopped, long ago, answering to fear. "There is a letter that should be read in this hall before any betrothal is spoken. It is written in the hand of the late Marquess of Selmount, witnessed and sealed, and lodged these 10 years with his lawyer at the town. It changes the matter entirely. I would not have brought it forward, but a wrong is about to be done under your roof, on the strength of half a man's wishes, and I could not stand at the wall and let it pass." Lady Margaret's face went white, and then dark. "She is a servant," she said, and her voice cracked high across the hall. "A fallen creature, with a fatherless child, lying to save her place. Take that paper from her. She has forged it, the wretch she has," and she stopped, because the king had raised one hand, and because a dowager marchioness, who fragments in front of her sovereign, has already lost a great deal more than an argument. "Let her speak," the king said, "and let me see the letter." Bran came forward then, out of the shadow by the door where he had stood unnoticed all evening, and he bore witness, plainly, in his rough 40-years voice, that he had carried both letters to the lawyer with his own hands, the first that her ladyship kept, and the second that she did not, and that the seal on the paper the maid held was the old Marquess's own, and that he would swear it on whatever the king liked. The lawyer's son had come too, brought quietly through the forest that afternoon by Bran's contrivance, and kept out of sight, and he stepped forward now, and confirmed the lodging and the seal and the date, and the codicil passed from Esme's hand into the king's, and the king read it, and the hall held its breath, and the antlers did not move on the walls. It was then that the man by the cold hearth crossed the room. He did not go to the king. He did not go to his aunt, who stood gripping the back of a chair as the ground she had stood on for 10 years gave way beneath her. He crossed the whole length of the great hall to where Esme stood alone in the center of it, and he took her hand in both of his in front of his brother and his aunt, and the assembled riders and the entire watching household, and into the silence the description of his face had made, he spoke the only words he had to spend. "I will marry no one but Esme," he said. The dowager made a sound. It was not a word. Lady Margaret, who had governed every Wreathaway affair within her reach for 10 years and had never in all that time been finally and publicly refused, opened her mouth and found nothing in it, and her hand came up to her throat, and she sat down hard in the chair she had been gripping, as though her bones had at last admitted what her pride would not. Across the room her certainty, the certainty that her script was the only one the world ran on, went out of her face like a candle pinched, and what was left, for one bare moment before she mastered it, was an old woman who had been wrong. The king looked from the letter in his hand to his brother and the maid, and something that had been heavy in his face for 2 years lifted. "The conditions of the first letter are struck out by the second," he said, "and the second asks only that you prove yourself the master your father hoped for." His eye went to the woman whose plain care had nursed his aunt through the fever, who had walked into a king's hall to stop a wrong, with nothing in her hands but the truth. "I think," the king said, "that the proving is done." He did not destroy his aunt. The niche of mercy is not the niche of triumph, and the king of that country was a man his brother had once ridden into battle for, and he understood the difference between correcting a wrong and feeding on it. Lady Margaret kept her jointure, and her rooms, and her rank. She lost only the thing she had loved more than any of them, which was the certainty that she alone knew how the family must go, and she lost it in front of the one audience she could not dismiss. Before the evening was out, she rose, gray and upright still, and crossed to where Esme stood, and in a voice scoured down to its plainest she said, "I nursed a grudge against you for being what you are, and you nursed me for nothing, and I find I cannot make the two of those things agree. I was wrong in this house. I have not often had to say it. It was not warmth. It was something harder and more honest than warmth, the recognition a proud person pays when the alternative is a lie, and Esme, who had learned what mercy was worth from the having so little of it, inclined her head and let the old woman keep her dignity, because cruelty in that moment would have made her smaller, and she had no wish to be small. They were married in the spring in the small gray church at the edge of the forest, with the snow gone entirely now, and the rides full of green and the wood loud with the birds come back to it. Mrs. Brazen Hesketh wept into her apron and pretended she had got smoke in her eyes. Bran stood up as a witness in a coat that had not seen daylight in 20 years, and looked throughout as though he might say something, and said nothing, and was perfectly understood. The king did not come, having ridden home, but he sent a thing that made his brother laugh aloud for the first time in living memory, which was a deed to the lodge itself, Ferrelwood and its forest, given out of the crown's gift to a brother who had at last. The accompanying line read, "Esme wore a gown of soft pale green that Mrs. Hesketh had sewn, and she carried no grand flowers, only a sprig of the first wild thing the thaw had turned up at the wood's edge. When the moment came that the old custom asked her name, she gave it whole and clear, the name she had stopped answering to and learned to answer to again on her own terms, and she watched the man beside her say his own, and she understood that she had walked out of one life into the storm, and the storm had carried her by no road she would have chosen, to exactly here. The child grew up in a house full of antlers and firelight and a forest at the door. Rena learned to walk in the great hall where her mother had once stood blue to the lips, and she learned the names of the trees from Bran and the proper way to mind a kitchen fire from Mrs. Waugh. Hesketh, and she called the scarred, quiet man who had opened a gate in a storm by a name that had nothing to do with rank, and he answered to it more gladly than he had ever answered to any other. On a winter evening years on, when the snow had come down again over Ferrelwood and the antlers shivered faintly on the walls and the fire stood the size of a doorway in the hearth, Esme came down late to settle a restless child and found her husband at the long deal table with a single candle, exactly as she had found him the first winter. Only now the glass before him held warm milk and not the wine. He had once been too grieved to drink. He had set out 2 cups. He had been waiting for her, the way a man waits who has nowhere in the world he would rather be, and knows it. On the shelf above the hearth, where Mrs. Petro Hesketh kept the things the house had decided mattered, stood a small piece of cherry wood worn smooth as a river stone. A child's rattle a silent man had carved one deep winter for a baby who had no business surviving the season, and had survived it anyway, and beside it leaned a square of black paper cut in the shape of a gentle, careful Nan. She acted not out of grief any longer, but out of gratitude, because every road has its beginning, and Esme had stopped somewhere across the years, wishing hers had run any other way. She sat down across from him in the candlelight and wrapped her cold hands around the warm cup, and outside the snow came down over the king's forest, soft and endless and harming no one, and the wren that nested every spring in the eave above the kitchen window slept somewhere in the wood, waiting, the way small surviving things wait for the turn of the year and the coming of the light. If a part of you has been waiting through some long winter of your own, to be seen by someone whose seeing would set the world right again, then stay a moment longer at this hearth, before you go, and carry the warmth of it out with you into whatever weather you must walk.